Awesome. Thank you, Diane. Appreciate that this morning. If you have not received a bulletin, let us know. We can hook you up. On the back is a place to take some notes and kind of track with our conversation for this morning. And on the front are our announcements for the week. So if you missed those, you'll have them there in hand. But as we dive into our conversation for this morning, there are a lot of buildings and structures around the world that when we see are instantly recognizable to us. So when you think of that big white building in Washington, D.C., you see a picture of that, you know what that is, right? It is the White House, appropriately named, of course, because it's white. We see that giant wall in China, we know that's the Great Wall of China. That huge clock tower in London, the Big Ben, that steel structure in Paris, the Eiffel Tower, maybe even going down under to Sydney, right, the Opera House, right? We see some of these buildings, and you don't have to be too culturally astute to know what they are. But I want to introduce you to another building this morning that you may or may not be familiar with. And I might not pronounce this right, but because I am not Spanish speaking. But this is the Sagrada Familia, right? It is a basilica in Barcelona, Spain. How many of y'all have seen this before? You guys ever seen this? Yeah, it's wild. I only kind of recently discovered this because they needed me to discover it, apparently. But this building, construction began on it in 1882, and the key word is began because construction is not yet complete. You see, this project has been ongoing for over 140 years, making it one of the longest-running construction projects in the world, right? And you think the construction project at your home is taking too long. But at least in Europe and among many Catholics, it is one of the more famous and recognizable buildings in the world because it is absolutely gorgeous. If you Google images of this thing, the artwork and the architecture are breathtaking. But it is still one of the largest unfinished Catholic churches ever built. Now again, there's a lot of reasons why this project is taking so long. You look at that building, and understandably, it's pretty expensive. And so they kind of work on it as funding comes in, right? It's mostly funded through private donations. You look at that building, right? You're not picking up drywall for it at Menards, right? Almost everything there is custom built. There's a lot of reasons it's taking so long, right? All of the details in there are symbolic and has experienced many setbacks over the past 140 plus years in this construction project. There was the Spanish Civil War. The original architects have been dead for some time now. They've changed the plans. And as I mentioned, all the material itself is custom built, right? There's limitations to the building itself that naturally slow it down. Again, Google the images of this. This is just the best one I had that was royalty free that I can share with you guys and later put up online. But it is gorgeous. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. But it is also, understandably, a massive project that has experienced one challenge after another. Like I said, funding, the very nature of the construction. There's geopolitical things that have slowed it down. So they've experienced many, many challenges in this massive project. Now, maybe as you come in the doors today, that kind of feels like your story, right? You're not a giant building, but you feel like a project. One that is ongoing, one that has experienced many, many challenges, and you might feel a little stuck. Because every single one of us have experienced challenges in life if you're not experiencing that today. Every single one of us have big challenges in front of us. Many of us are maybe walking through a tough season in our marriages, maybe a tough season with different relationships with close loved ones, and you have a challenge, right? How do I move forward with this issue? Maybe you have a certain health diagnosis that you've received or a loved one's received, and you have this challenge sitting in front of you, and you're wondering how to move forward. Maybe you're contemplating a career transition or walking through a career transition. Here's this challenge that lays in front of me. How do I move forward? Maybe even walk in the doors today, and the crisis that you experience is a spiritual one. You're having a crisis of your faith. Do you actually believe the things that your parents taught you? Do you believe anything that's spoken about in this church, or are you really wrestling with the reality of who God says He is? All of us have big challenges in front of us, big things that we are walking through, things that seemingly kind of slow us down in life. So if you have your notes, you're going to see that we're wrestling with this question today: how should we approach these challenges of life? We're starting a new series this morning that I entitled Under Construction as we walk through the book of Nehemiah. So we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 1 today, looking at verses 1 through 11. And if you have your pew Bible, it's page 468. So as we walk through Nehemiah over the course of the next several weeks, just a little background information I want to set now about this book is this book focuses upon the character of Nehemiah. Right? Nehemiah is one of many Jewish individuals who have been exiled from the land. You see, when you study Israel's history, they had a civil war of sorts that took place. The northern and southern kingdom split, and each of these kingdoms were eventually conquered by greater empires. Right? The Assyrians, the Babylonians, and both those empires came and gone, and then ultimately the Persians take over, and Israel's still in exile, and Nehemiah is one of those individuals who's exiled under Persian rule. But here's the thing. Even though the nation of Israel was exiled from their land, hauled off from their land, hauled to a distant land, there's still a small remnant of Jewish people who are in the land, some of which never actually left, some of which were able to make the trip back. And so Nehemiah is there serving King Xerxes, the Persian king, as a cupbearer. And as we kind of step into this narrative, we're going to kind of walk with Nehemiah through this kind of emotional, spiritual journey of trying to figure out what God is doing. You see, the nation of Israel is split. They are divided. They are spread out. Again, some are in exile. Some are back in the land. Some have tried to rebuild the nation of Israel, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but they have been unsuccessful. And this country, this people group is broken down. They're vulnerable to many unfriendly groups in the area. And what you'll see, and Nehemiah certainly senses this, and you see this in the first few verses of our text, the heart and the morale of the people have been gutted. And Nehemiah has a burden to do something about it. So we're going to get some more information here as we move forward in the next few weeks. But I just want you to see that, again, as we talk about challenges this morning, maybe a challenging season of life you're walking through, a challenge that lays before you, you're not alone, right? Many people have walked through challenges before, and Nehemiah and the Hebrew people are certainly facing a challenging season, as we see here in Nehemiah. How they walk through this challenging season in their history can inform us what we do through our difficult seasons as well. So since we're talking about architecture and famous buildings, and since we're approaching 250 here in the U.S., do you guys recognize this monument? I really hope you do. Okay, very good. I see some nods. Right, that's the Washington Monument. Now, we talked about that famous Catholic building there in Spain, but this is here in the U.S. And this construction of this monument started in 1848. Now, this monument, built to kind of honor George Washington, our nation's first president, was originally supposed to be over 600 feet tall. An incredibly tall structure, very ambitious, particularly for the 1840s when they started this project. And so construction began and it progressed. And builders, though, as they're moving forward with this project, had to confront a simple but very critical question. Right, they are building this monument, and actually you can kind of see where they paused halfway. You can see different brick there. I learned this as I was preparing this message. The Washington Monument, right, they stopped for a season, and as they kind of stop for a season and they restart building it, they had to ask the question, you know, when they put the original plans in place, can the foundation actually support the weight that we're going to put on it? Because as you imagine, this is a very heavy building, right? It's incredibly tall. It's built with very heavy materials. And they found that the original foundation for this building was relatively shallow. And it would be questionable whether or not it could support the enormous weight that they were going to ask it to bear. And so again, construction is ongoing. It had been delayed for things like the Civil War. You know, funds dried up, and even though they started in the 1840s, it's not until the 1870s when they resume this project and ask that question, can the foundation support the weight we're going to put on it? And they found out and realized that it could not. And so rather than pushing forward with this project because, hey, man, this thing's been in the works for a while, let's get this thing done, they take a few steps back and they almost restart, right? They expand the foundation, they reinforce it so that it can properly carry the weight of this building. Now, again, this delay, this attention to the foundation delayed the project and understandably increased the cost, right? It's like any project we do. You can count on it costing double the money and twice the time, if you're lucky. But it delayed the project. It wasn't until 1884 when it was finished, right? Nearly 40 years. Can you imagine that today? A whole generation. But the builders were not afraid to ask some tough questions. They did not ignore the potential problem of that foundation and just hope the problem went away. They pushed forward with doing the right thing, adding the needed reinforcements to the foundation despite the delay and the cost of the project. Now imagine if they ignored that. If they just said, you know what, this has been taking too long, let's just build it. Let's not ask the question. Right? Imagine, right, years later they get this thing built and families are in there walking around visiting and that thing just crumbles. Right? Tragedy would happen. Right? Imagine, right, they don't even get to finish it. They're almost done and they're putting like the point on the top and the thing crumbles, and what does that say about them and our country? It would reflect poorly, right? So they weren't afraid to ask the tough questions, even if the answer to those questions was hard. Because what would have been worse is not asking that question altogether. In fact, it would be downright haunting if you were on that project and later on it crumbles with people inside. And so the point I want you to kind of see here as we look at the Washington Monument is sometimes asking questions is hard. We can get a hard answer. But not asking can sometimes haunt us. Right? A difficult answer can hurt, but an unasked question can haunt. Just like with the Washington Monument. If they did not ask the question, can the foundation support the weight of this building? By ignoring that, it could have had disastrous consequences. Again, maybe some of you are facing some deep challenges today, and you have gone into protection mode, burying your head in the sand. And you figure, if I don't ask the questions, then the problem just goes away. We all know that's not true, but that's sometimes how we operate. Maybe you're afraid to ask the question, is my marriage okay? Because we're afraid of the answer. Maybe you're afraid to ask the question, is this small indulgence of mine, is this actually a real major sin problem? We figure if we don't ask it, then it'll go away. Maybe we ask ourselves, is the challenge I'm facing, has it been caused by self-infliction? Has it been caused by my own sin and brokenness? Or am I just blaming other people? Am I leading my family like God has required me and asked me to do? Again, sometimes asking a hard question will give us a hard answer, but unasked questions can haunt. If you aren't willing to ask the question, you can find yourself haunted by inaction years later. So how should we approach the challenges of life? We're going to dive into our text here in a moment. But as we look at our text, what I want you to see, because Nehemiah does this, as we approach the challenges of life, we are to approach them with a sense of curiosity. Right? Have the courage to ask the tough questions. Approach the challenges of life with curiosity. And we'll kind of talk about some of these questions here in a moment. But let's go ahead and look at our text. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1 through 2. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hathkilah. Now it happened in the month of Shizviv, there we go. We're going to go with that. In the 20th year, I can read, guys. As in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. Man, I practice saying those words. Okay. We start out here, and I kind of highlighted it there for you in the bottom half of verse 2. Nehemiah asked a question. he asks a question. He inquires about the well-being of the Jewish people living in the land who have escaped exile. He asks a hard question. He's curious, and he has to be ready for an answer that he may or may not like. And so again, Nehemiah is living in Persia. He's serving King Xerxes as a cupbearer. He is miles and miles away, nearly 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem, and he just wants to hear about his people and his land. And so he inquires about them. He asks the question because he's concerned about them. He asks the question because, as we'll see, he is actively praying for them. And here his answer comes. We see it in verse 3. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who have survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Right, so there we see the Hebrew people are not doing well. The question that Nehemiah asked comes back, and he receives some bad news. You see, the Hebrew people, as I mentioned already, there's been a remnant there in the land, and they made efforts to rebuild the wall and the gates, but they were squashed. And as has been reported, it's not just a physical reality, but there is a real emotional and spiritual reality for the people living there. They are gutted. They are experiencing, right in the language there of the ESV, great trouble and shame. This is an assessment not only of, again, the physical realities of the land, but the spiritual reality of the people living there. They have been beaten down and adopted the mindset of complete defeat. They are powerless as a people. But this was the question that Nehemiah asked, right? How are they doing? And this is the answer that he gets. Now, I just want to reflect on some of the realities that we have, right? We might have a hard challenge in front of us. And if we don't ask the question, it doesn't make the problem go away. Just like with Nehemiah, whether or not he asked the question was not going to negate the reality of the Hebrew people there in Jerusalem. They were still going to deal with hardships, whether or not he asked. But knowledge about the situation set him up at this point to make a choice. What was he going to do with that information? See, many disasters begin when we stop asking questions. Wisdom often starts with the courage to ask. Again, as you walk in today, and maybe you're facing a challenge of some sort, a challenging season of life, a relational tension, a reality about what to do with your future, have you asked questions about it? Are you afraid to ask God about that reality because of the answer that you may discover? Are you afraid to ask because of the sacrifice God might ask of you? Or are you burying your head in the sand? Have you talked to God about the issue at all? So as we experience challenges of life, what we see here modeled by Nehemiah is it's important for us to have a sense of curiosity. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Now, I showed you guys this probably at least last year. But in my hometown, Palm Bay, Florida, there is this piece of land in the southwest corner of town, nearly 3,000 acres. And back in the 80s, a company bought up this land, they built roads, and they parceled off little lots, right? Their intention was to build this giant neighborhood in the city. And in the 80s, the real estate market did not do very well, particularly in Florida. And so this project was literally abandoned halfway through. And so literally today, you go out there, and this is actually some nicer pictures. You go out there, and there's just, it looks like an apocalyptic world, right? The roads are torn up. There's burning like piles of tires everywhere. They find dead bodies there all the time. I'm not exaggerating. It is a problem in our town. But it's a great place if you like doing things outdoors too. You just kind of navigate around the bodies and the drugs. But here's the thing. This was a project that was started in the 80s by a company called the General Development Corporation. They built over 200 miles of roadway there. They sold the lot to thousands of people, many of which have never even stepped foot in the state of Florida, because they were going to develop this large community. But they went bankrupt, and their plans never materialized. And now that land sits vacant and undeveloped. See, the company, and particularly its leaders, failed. And it now sits as a reminder of its failed business venture. In fact, again, the city is continually arguing about what to do with this land because it's all split up among literally thousands of people in small sections. They can't just grab sections of it and do what they want. But the company back in the 80s and its leaders, they overextended themselves. And some of the leaders were held responsible for the mess that occurred, right? A lot of people lost a lot of money. A lot of people lost jobs. They were in a mess. And its leaders, some of which were held responsible. Some of us are in a mess as well. And maybe it is a mess that we caused or contributed to. Because the reality is, if you're like me, most of the problems you have in life, if you're honest, you may or may not have started, but you certainly contributed to, right? You didn't make it any better, right? Maybe, right, your marriage today is struggling and falling apart because you are married to a difficult person. But maybe you aren't that loving or supportive either. Maybe you're experiencing financial hardship because the markets and the economy, right, they aren't doing well. But maybe you contribute to it as well because you drifted away from sound financial principles. Maybe you've experienced a crisis of faith because someone has hurt you in the church. But maybe you've continued to use that as an excuse to run from God. See, the reality is many of us face challenges in life, but often we either directly or indirectly cause them and or contribute to them. So if you experience challenges in life, the first thing to do is approach these challenges with a bit of curiosity. Have the courage to ask the tough questions. But also what you need to do is you need to confess, right? Confession, acknowledge your role in the situation. Acknowledge your role in the situation. Verse 4, Nehemiah asked the question. He gets the answer there in verse 3, and here's his response. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So Nehemiah asked the question, and he gets the news that's hard to hear. And here we see a report of him grieving this news. He is both disappointed and surprised, right? Disappointed, right? Why aren't things going better? Right? The people were in the land. Last I heard, they were starting this rebuilding, right? What is happening? He's disappointed. And he's also surprised. Why aren't they further along? And even though it's not what he expected, even though it's not the answer he wanted, he still grieves this loss. He grieves the challenge that lay before the Hebrew people. Maybe you're disappointed in the challenge that you're facing. Maybe you're disappointed in yourself for some decisions you've made. You're disappointed in others for things and problems that they've caused. Maybe you're upset, right? You figured you'd be further along at this point in your life. You'd be in a different place in your marriage or at work. Take the time to grieve that loss, right? Nehemiah gets this news, and the next thing he does is he pauses and just feels all those feelings. He grieves the loss. And the language there tells us there in the text that he talks to God in the midst of it. He continues fasting and praying, wrestling with the reality of the brokenness of his people. Verse 5, Then I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. He's grieving, but he takes that grief and his disappointment and he turns to God. He's not upset with God. He's not blaming him, as we'll see, but rather he knows that the brokenness and the real challenge that lay before the Hebrew people, he knows that only God can help in that situation. Only God can comfort him and comfort the people in their distress. Only God can help move things forward there in Jerusalem. He doesn't run from God in that challenge, but rather he runs to God. And maybe that's helpful for us as well. Again, whatever you're walking through today, I don't know about you, but sometimes my impulse is to run from God. And what we see modeled here is in the midst of this horrible news, in the midst of this grieving process, Nehemiah runs to him. Now here's what I really want you to pay attention to, verse 6 through 7. He's talking to God, he's praying, and he says this, Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Verse 6 there, he's praying to God. And he calls out, right? God, listen to me, right? You see that in verse 6. I highlighted it there in yellow. Hear the prayer of your servant. And as he's talking to God, seeing this challenge laying up in front of him and the Hebrew people, he acknowledges their responsibility for the mess that they are in, right? And he acknowledges it from a corporate perspective, but also a personal perspective, right? He says, right, in the latter end of verse 6, day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel. Right? The nation had sinned against God, turned their backs against him. And the reality is they are experiencing judgment for that. But he doesn't leave it there, which is kind of interesting because it's so normal for us to say the U.S. is so broken. Right? Polk, there's so much brokenness around here. Man, the church is so messed up. But the reality is we all contribute to the problem as well. And I love how Nehemiah confesses the sins from a corporate perspective, but even turns it on himself. The brokenness in his own life, you see that in the second part of verse 6. Even I and my father's house have sinned. He realizes that he's contributed to the problem as well. And again, whatever the challenge that lay in front of you, realistically, you didn't bring all the mess to it, but realistically as well, you contributed to it. You brought your own brokenness and sin into the equation and compounded the problem. Verse 7, we, right, he's including himself in this conversation. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments. He confesses and acknowledges the nation's role in their exile, right? It wasn't just bad luck. They're experiencing God's judgment, but he's also confessing his role in the situation. He's confessing and acknowledging his brokenness. And again, for us, as you walk through a challenge today, realistically, again, the challenge that you're walking through, you probably contribute to it as well. Right? The brokenness in the marriage, the financial situation, the lost job, the transition in life you're going through. Right? Things come at us, but if you're like me, a human being, you bring your own brokenness into it, and you bring your mess as well, and you contribute to the problem. Verse 8 and 9. Nehemiah continues talking to God. He says, remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, which I always love when we do this in prayer, and I see this in text, like God forgets what he said. But this is important because it's not necessarily to remind God what he said, because God knows what he said and what he promised to the people. It's in many ways for Nehemiah to remind himself and to remind the people as well what God said. Verse 8, remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples, right? If you don't follow me, right, I will scatter you. So they're experiencing the judgment of their actions. Verse 9, but if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. Nehemiah reminds God, in many ways reminding himself and the people what God had said. And then he reminds the people again, not only of the judgment of not following him, but the promise of following him, right? If you return to me and keep my commandments, right, I will gather you again. Now we look at this text with our own problems and issues, and it's so easy to read our situation into that promise that God made Israel. And I want to establish we are not Israel. This promise is not for us. This is for Israel. But the reality is we experience issues just like this as well. Many of us are experiencing hardships and problems and pain because of our own brokenness, by drifting away from Christ. And God will often allow us to experience the pain of our sin. It's important for us to acknowledge that maybe your challenge that you're facing today is due to your own sin patterns. Maybe that broken relationship has been caused because of an addiction that you have, maybe with substances, with illicit material. Maybe you're experiencing pain in your finances because you're having a hard time with contentment. Maybe you're experiencing a job loss because of poor choices you made at work. God allowed Israel to feel the pain of the choices that they made. And maybe God's allowing you to feel that pain as well. But again, there's hope in this passage, and there's hope for us as well, which we will kind of get to as we move through this series. But it's important for us, again, as you walk in the doors today and you're experiencing some pain, a challenge that lay before you, to grieve the loss, as we see modeled by Nehemiah. Maybe you need to spend some time to grieve the loss of the relationship. Maybe you need to grieve the loss of the lost time or the dream that you had for your future, because the reality looks a lot different. Don't be afraid in the midst of that pain to run to God, to confess your role in the issue, and to remind yourself of God's provision, right? He loves you. Approach the challenges of life with a bit of curiosity, asking the tough questions. Why am I experiencing the pain I'm experiencing? Approach the challenges of life with confession, right? Acknowledging your role in the situation. I have one more building thing for you. Pools again, guys. We talk about this all the time. When I was cleaning pools, it wasn't uncommon for about 1 or 2 a year, they'd replaster them. These are 2 different pools, but they would drain the pool and they would chip all that plaster off and replaster it. And I don't have a picture of this exact project, but there was one pool I was doing that they went through a replaster. And so I don't do much for a few weeks there, and I go and show up ready to start the chemistry up on this new plaster job. And I'm informed that don't worry about it. They need to rip all that plaster back off because they put the plaster in, but they had the wrong color, right? The person paid a lot of money to put it in, and by the time it dries and sets, the owner's not too happy with it, right? That's not the color I wanted. And so the company has to drain the water yet again and replaster it. A couple of weeks go by, I show back up, ready to do startup chemistry on it again, and I'm informed, don't mess with it. We need to rip it off again because though they got the color right, something was wrong with the mix, and there's these little hairline cracks all over it. So they drain it yet once again, and fortunately for them, the third time was the charm. Right? They had to do it 3 times to get it right. The company did not make money on that replaster job, and I didn't work for that company. It was another company. They didn't make money on that replaster job, and it cost them, at least in the short term, but at least hopefully in the long run, right, they kind of cemented their reputation of at least doing what it took to get the job done right. They did what they needed to do, no matter the pain that it cost their wallets and their schedule. You see, many of us in the midst of a challenging season of life, we need to adopt the same mindset. No matter the pain, we need to do what is right. If you approach a challenging season of life, it's important for you to do so with a sense of commitment. Right? Do the next right thing. And then I would say, do it again, and then do it again, and do it again. Nehemiah gets news about the pain the people are going through. He grieves the loss. He confesses the sin of the people and of his own sin, how he contributed to the problem. And then we see here that he is committed to do the next right thing. And for him, at least at this time right now, it's prayer. Check out verse 10 through 11 as we finish up in our passage today. He's continuing his prayer to God. He says, "They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was the cupbearer of the king," right? A little foreshadowing for where we'll be next week. But Nehemiah gets news about this, and what he does is he grieves, he confesses, and he prays. In fact, he sits with it for a while. If you go back to verse 1, it indicates the time frame in which he asked the question, and next week as we step into verse 12, we see the time frame in which he actually does something with this. And so he is sitting with this tension for several months, anywhere from 2 to 4 months, praying to God, seeking an opportunity to do something. He's committed to doing the next right thing. And at this point in time, until God begins to kind of give him a vision and open up doors of opportunity, the next right thing for him is to pray. He prays for a long time because he's committed to doing the next right thing. Again, many of us right now, sometimes we might pray about an issue once or twice and forget about it by next week. This was not Nehemiah's case. These people have been on his mind and heart for a long time, and he's grieved by the pain they're going through. And so in the midst of this challenging season, he prays. He prays, he prays, he prays, and he waits for God to reveal what to do next. And so if you are walking through a tough season, maybe in a marriage, maybe financially, maybe with your job, maybe spiritually, I want to encourage you to pray. Continue praying for God's intercession and help. Right? What challenge do you need help with today? As you approach the challenging seasons of life, do so with a sense of curiosity. Why am I experiencing this problem? Ask the tough questions. Acknowledge your role in the broken situation you are going through. And then commit to do the next right thing. And if you don't know what it is at this point, I can guarantee you prayer should be on that list. Now, we started out by looking at the Sangrita Familia. Again, this is the best image I could find of it, royalty-free, where I could share with you guys and share online. But this thing is still not finished, right? Hopefully you can kind of see the cranes there in the background, right? 140 plus years so far, and it's still not finished. But like I said, even the unfinished product is beautiful. It's an amazing piece of architecture. And when the original architect put the plans into place, he knew that it was going to take a long time to do this project, right? It wasn't just a room he was remodeling. He was building a work of art, a massive work of art. And he's quoted as saying, "My client is not in a hurry." Obviously, his client was God. He's building a church, right? And for us, right, sometimes we want to arrive. We want to feel like, hey, man, we are a finished product. We want to have a sense of closure on the challenges that we're walking through. But the reality is, until Christ returns or until we die, we are not a finished product. Christ is continuing to work in our lives, and even though we are a work in progress, each and every one of you are beautiful and loved because Christ came and he died for you. He loves you. Again, so if you feel like that building continually in progress, continually dealing with challenges, I want to encourage you today to begin that challenge with prayer and wholehearted dependence upon God. 2 questions, we'll be done. What challenges are you or those you love currently facing? And what would a dependence upon God in that situation look like for you? Let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. God, thank you so much for this text and just the opportunity to start walking through the book of Nehemiah. And God, I pray for the person who walks in here today just wrestling with a hard thing in front of them, Lord, a challenge, dealing with something in their life that they did not anticipate. God, no matter how they found themselves in that situation, Lord, whether it was brought on by them or perpetuated by them, God, I pray that they run to you with a wholehearted dependence upon you, that they spend time in prayer wrestling with this issue and wrestling with you, just asking, Lord, what do I do next? God, may we approach these issues in our life with a dependence that was modeled for us by Nehemiah. God, we love you, and we struggle to get this right, so please help us with this today. In your amazing name, amen.